It's an interesting debate that you may or not know occurs, especially in today's world. There are many who will remind other folks that Jesus and his family were refugees. And there is actual significant argument against that fact. Unfortunately, there's hardly any proof of the fact that he would not be. There's multitudes of proof. In fact, we just saw Jesus moving from in his family from one place to another, like actually 3 different places in this scripture. So he was doing so, and his family was doing so, not he, but his parents, out of fear. Now, I don't know, it was out of personal fear. It may not have been out of political fear or strife between clans. It was personal fear. He had a bounty on his head. So it is an interesting thing that people will most likely not want to admit that Jesus was a refugee and an immigrant. And so in today's world, we are dealing with immigration issues. It is the one thing, strangely enough, that we have found that evangelical Christians are very testy about immigration. And this is one of the biggest issues in their sort of political docket these days. And they are fighting hard tooth and nail against the idea that Jesus was an immigrant, which there's no basis for their argument whatsoever. You just read this right here. He was. And so we have to understand them, or at least to place into a context. Now, you can put a lot of weight on this, or you can put a little weight on this. So obviously, we're seeing different reasons to do so. For many, whether it even matters today. But we have to understand that immigration almost often always occurs because someone's life is not good somewhere, and oftentimes is dangerous somewhere. And so people have to move from one place to the other. And we can see it's not just an issue today, but it is an issue back then. And it's been happening over time. People aren't safe, and so they want to go to places that are safe. So we need to be thinking about that. I want to make sure you understand that right now Mark Pierce, and I don't know if he's completed this project or not, is attempting to get together 10 families, to help bring a refugee family to the U.S. Mark, have you found all families yet?
Yes, we have actually 50 people, 7 from this church, and the rest are from other churches and the communities. We're going to have our kickoff meeting on January 11th.
Excellent. Great job, Mark. So 15 families have put forth their pledge to support this one family. It takes a lot, obviously, to bring a family in, because not one family, none of us have that kind of backing or financial or even time wealth to give to a family. Of course, there's language barriers and cultural barriers and social barriers, all kinds of things. So thank goodness that people like Mark and the group called IRIS, which is in New Haven, which settles refugees all over the state of Connecticut, exist for people to come to find safety and care where they could not find that elsewhere. And this is what is happening with Jesus. His family cannot find safety until they finally have realized that the ruler that was searching for him has died. And even when he was told to come back, he didn't feel safe. So he went elsewhere to Nazareth, according to the book of Matthew. Well, you see, I make heavy comment about this is because it's just so apparent. So often, I think, we can take our religious life and think, well, it's just an interesting thing, or it's a personal thing, that our spiritual life, our religious life, we read these stories and we say, well, I'm going to use them in order to inform myself. But oftentimes we can fool ourselves into believing that it doesn't necessarily have to inform our culture, which I think it should. And for many different ways, in many different ages, this kind of living our faith out in a true and firm way has oftentimes not been true. We say one thing and yet we do another. And being true to the Scripture, being true to the spirit of what is being attempted to be portrayed is a very important thing. Now, we also have to realize is that there are times in Scripture that we have to read this in the manner which it would have been read in those days. The Scripture, I need to tell you, was not written for people like you and I, and you and me, because they spoke in symbology in many times, in many ways. They spoke in ways that to hearken back to old stories that they already knew, and that they could bring forth emotions in order to get the point across of something. And so sometimes we don't allow ourselves to have those same emotions. Sometimes the stories do touch us, but you know what? We're a pretty heady lot. We like to intellectualize things a great deal, and sometimes even just sort of reason them away. But each of these stories that we read are meant to draw upon a history of knowledge and of experience. And that is one thing that we need to include more than into our religious and spiritual life, is not being afraid to allow our feelings to point us in certain directions, rather than our mind telling us another thing. So this is in many ways a story about fleeing, about not being safe. And of course, people who wasn't safe is who? The person who is supposed to save his nation, his people, and now 2,000 years later save any number of people of different cultures. So it's weird that this person who is going to save others in a special way had needed to be saved themselves. So this is the story, though, of Jesus, and this is the story of our life. Now, I want to sort of preview what's going to happen in the next year, because I think it takes some guts and it takes some emotion for us to be able to do some of the things that we as a group, whether it be council or an ad hoc group or deacons or even you, if you decide to come up with even something else, we're gonna have some heavy duty themes this upcoming year. We have decided as a council to delve more into our open and affirming status, to talk more openly about the welcome and the affirmation of gay and lesbian and trans people. This, of course, is an enormous issue in our culture today. For us not to do it would be a strange thing, because it's sort of like all this is happening over here and we can't sort of put our back to it. Especially since we've said almost 10 years ago that we need to be a part of what's going on. And so we are going to put that some oomph into that this year. And so I want you then to tap into that feeling of emotion, that gut feeling. Now, I know that some people, though, may have some gut feelings that they're not all that comfortable with, right? I mean, let's face it. Some of us just aren't quite sure about this. Some of us are absolutely, perhaps, against it. But I think the majority of the people in the church have this gut feeling that gay and lesbian and trans people have been persecuted and have been set aside and have been ignored and have been made to feel less than. And so we need to take then that feeling and that understanding and realizing, we've been set aside in the past for this, that, or the other reason. We need to take that feeling for ourselves and allow it to speak to that other ministry. And we're going to try to do that this year, is use some of the emotion, not just the head stuff. Let's use our hearts in leading in this issue. The second issue we're going to talk to this year has been brought up by an ad hoc group of folks who came to my house every Wednesday night in October. We had a potluck and then a book discussion about the climate. I have secured 3 different state legislators to come and speak to us and with us about this issue. I don't know if you know that the town, you saw in the paper this week, they've received a bronze certificate for sustainability. I'm not so sure what that all means, but I have written to the town and Norm and I've asked how can we understand what this is and be incorporated in it. We know we have our solar panels up on the roof, and we know, so we've got to get some of the feeling in there too. Because do you know the one thing that rises above all other things, whether it be a political issue or a social issue in young people today? What's that one thing? It's the climate. They know, they believe, they understand that this is vital, that we deal with our climate and how we are affecting it. And so in order to do that, we've grown dependent upon doing things in a different way. Let's face it. We get in our cars for just about any reason these days. And we have 3, 4, sometimes 5 cars, some households. And everyone will take one of them and go off and be using that. We've become dependent on that way, which is, in itself is not a particularly bad thing. But its effect can be very deleterious to our climate and to the future for our world. And so we need to then start getting in touch with what it means then to change and not allow, because sometimes we can't convince our heads to, but we can convince our bodies that a change needs to be had. Okay, as I'm getting a little bit older, I'm starting to realize the body is not reacting the same way. In fact, I can't believe I'm still standing right now. My knee is killing me. But in some other things, I've got to change some of the things I'm doing in my life in order to make things better. And the same thing goes then with how we deal with things around us. We have to come up with ways to become more involved. So how do we do that? I made mention in our passages, I think last month, is the only way we can really do this is if we're sort of stirred up from within. Emotionally, intellectually, yes, but also calling upon something else to help us overcome our prejudices, our habits, those things which we've come so used to doing, because sometimes we don't even realize what we're doing to the world. I've told this before. All right, if you know the answer, some of you know it already. Here's something. I love a good steak. Who loves a good steak? Who's a vegetarian in here? No vegetarians. Wow. All right. So a pound of beef. If you know the answer, you're not allowed to, because I've told you. A pound of beef. I want you to guess how many gallons of water is needed to create 1 pound of beef. Take a guess, anybody who doesn't know. Good guess. 1,800 gallons of water. 1,800 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. So that goes from watering the cow to growing the grain that the cow eats to supporting the industries that make the beef come to fruition. So you see, the amount of water we're using, especially in a water-starved world, is ridiculous. That's why you hear so many people saying, no more beef, or don't eat the beef, or go vegetarian, or whatever. The world is being populated with humans like crazy, more and more and more, and each wanting the kind of lifestyle that you and I live. Because the rest of the world doesn't live the kind of lifestyle we live. We've been living with a great deal of fortune. And they all want it, and they're driving hard to get it and join us. Well, if they get it, there will be no more water. It's going to be crazy. So we've been given the dominion, as it says in Genesis, over the planet, over our creation. And so if we're going to have that dominion, I pray that we're able to take our guts and our understanding and our compassion for others, and especially our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, so that their world can be here in a safe way in the future. The church can make a difference. It can change the way that we do church also. So these are just some of the things that we're dealing with. It's a lot. My head's already rattling all over the place trying to think and plan these things out. But they're worthy of doing. And I pray that you join me in it, because when we read the scripture, whether it be about refugees and immigration, or if we read like the beginning of the book, the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, when we read that we have dominion over the earth, it is meant for us to become more involved spiritually, religiously, socially, in caring for the world and caring for one another. So I pray, as this sort of dry sermon found its way through here, okay, that we begin to get off of that intellectual thing and get onto more of an emotional thing. And part of it is also then going to be about me teaching you a little bit more about prayer and meditation, because this is where we're going to find the power. We're going to find the power through our prayer, through meditation, through our contact with God, and through our contact with our heart. So I pray, my friends, that you and I will please follow through and be people of love and compassion for the world, for the people, and for ourselves. With that in mind, you each have a candle.